The answer to it has got to be, how can the government set up an arena in which people who are affected by these problems, particularly in a place, it's harder to do if you have air pollution that's going across the country, so that they can have a chance to listen to one another, to understand what the other guys.
To start taping now, but we're going to have. I won't actually start it for a while, but just start taping so you can get used to it.
I've been rolling.
Okay.
So that where that and where they once decide they can do a lot more together than they can by fighting each other, then it's like magic. Everything changes, and they begin to think, well, if that's what you want us to do, we can do that. We can't do that, or we may be able to accomplish this purpose, do it this way, and it'll have the same end result. And all of a sudden they begin to work together, and we've got a river in the southern part of Puget Sound called the Nisqually, in which there's an Indian tribe, a lot of small farms. Weyerhaeuser has a big timber operation there. Fort Lewis is in that same watershed, so is Mount Rainier, and there are a lot of small towns there. They have come together around a plan that they've all signed on to, and it's about 80% completed now. And that river is essentially restored from where it was when it started.
But is that somehow unique to the Northeast, which has a greater history of collaboration?
You mean Northwest, you mean?
Northwest, or maybe even more environmental awareness. Is that unique to them and harder to duplicate elsewhere?
It is. I think the answer to your question, there's a couple of answers to it. I don't think it's unique to the Northwest that people have common problems and are able to come together and work on those collectively. It's much harder in urban areas where you've got watersheds that people don't even know they live in, much less sort of identify with a watershed. It's much easier in less settled rural watersheds where people really do feel an attachment to their place. It's easier to get them to sense that I live in the Nisqually watershed. I mean, the Cedar River runs through Seattle. You ask people, what do you think of the Cedar River? Where's that? And they may live in the watershed where it is. So that it won't solve that kind of problem. But where you find people identifying with their place, Puget Sound is an example. People identify with Puget Sound. They ask you where you live. A lot of them will say Seattle, but others will say, I live in Puget Sound. And so that means a lot to them. And you can galvanize or galvanize cooperative efforts in a place like that. But the best place to do it is in a watershed where people really know they live in the Nisqually River, or they live in the Skagit River, or the Dungeness River here in the Northwest.
But is that where we're going? Because as an environmental world, we have been looking at point sources now since the beginning of the Clean Water Act, which we're now celebrating its 40th anniversary. But you seem to be talking about things beyond point source issues, aren't you?
Yeah, I really am. I think point sources where we had major dischargers of pollution from either industrial or sometimes municipal facilities that were visible and you could almost smell, touch, and feel them. Using the national permit system and our enforcement responsibilities, we were able to bring those kinds of problems under social control. They're not gone. I mean, they're never gone. You have to stay on top of these kind of environmental problems or they'll recur. But in those cases, we've largely brought that under control. Now, the next stage is all the rest of us, the runoff from city streets, from suburban and urban areas, as well as rural and farm areas that are uncontrolled, essentially. And it's just rainwater that runs off the land, or even river water or flood water that will erode the land, that brings everything that is deposited on the land into the receiving water. And that is a much tougher problem to solve because it involves people's use of land, their ownership of land. And as an example, here in the state of Washington, the Department of Ecology, with not nearly the number of inspectors they need to discharge the responsibilities they have, will take some young guy out of Evergreen College with 6 months experience and give him a manual and send him out into the rural areas and say, tell the farmers how to manage their land. Well, here's some fifth-generation farmer who looks at his manual and says, that ain't got anything to do with my land, number one. And number two, why are you telling me what to do? And so that's a sort of a prescription for conflict as opposed to resolution. And people have to be trained as to how to deal with citizens who must be treated much like customers are to a major corporation, and convince them that what they're doing can be adjusted consistent with their needs as well as the needs of the environment. And that takes somebody who's experienced and who knows how to deal with people and who knows some of the issues that exist on these lands that need to be addressed in a more sensible way.
But you seem to be moving into a model different than our current model. Our environmental laws have really grown up in a fairly prescriptive way with laws and then regulations and then a fairly, commitment to enforcement of those. You seem to be talking about a more collaborative process.
Yes, it has to. I don't think we should get rid of standard setting enforcement. It just doesn't fit every environmental problem. And it isn't the best way to solve those environmental problems. In fact, in some ways, it doesn't solve them at all. Many of the problems that we have in the Chesapeake Bay, as well as places like Puget Sound, the Great Lakes, even along the coast in the Gulf of Mexico, are non-point source problems. It's runoff from the land that's causing a lot of the problems. And you can't sit in an office in Washington or even in a state office and develop a set of standards for the management of that land that make any sense when you get on the land. You've got to move yourself up a level and say, what is it we're trying to accomplish here? We're trying to protect the water from toxic substances, from nutrients that are causing algae blooms and dissolved oxygen problems. And if this is the goal of environmental improvement, then who knows how to fix them? It's the people who are causing the problem that know how to fix it. Once you describe what the problem is, and then you step back and leave it up to them to figure out how to do it. Now, you still need to step in an enforcement way if there's scofflaws or they don't pay any attention to what you're asking them to do. But it's a process where it has to be, a lot of attention has to be paid to process and to fairness to get the public to the point, who live in that watershed, to the point where they have begun to take steps to improve the water. They understand what's needed to be done, and their neighbors aren't doing it. Then they are more sympathetic with the government coming in and telling people, you've got to change the way in which you're managing the land. So it's a more lengthy process, particularly up front, but the back end of it can be enormously successful. And a lot of the time spent in enforcing the laws is spent at the back end. It's not the front end. And so it's tough for people to say, well, this just takes so long to get people. But we've been at it now almost 40 years in the Clean Water Act, and we've still got pollution problems from non-point source landowners that are just as bad as they were when we started.
I want to ask you one aspect of what you're talking about, and that is the role of states there, because when you talk about non-point source, you're talking about, at least in the past, a quintessential state role. You are unique in all of the officials of the federal government in that you have seen the Environmental Protection Agency as its leader on 2 occasions but at different times. And then third now, as a leader here in the state and a leader of corporations, you've seen EPA and states from afar. Can you talk about how that has changed in your a lifetime, focusing first on your first time at EPA, then your second time at EPA, and that's the role of states in environmental issues? Well,
I started my career in the environment in the state of Indiana when I was in the Indiana Attorney General's office, and I represented the State Board of Health, which many of these problems, of what we now call environmental problems, were in the beginning health problems. And many of the states address the issue of environmental or public health problems from the public health department. So when I was in the Indiana Attorney General's office, I represented the State Department of Health, and the Air Pollution Control Board, the Water Pollution Control Board were in the State Board of Health. And because states competed so strongly for the location of industry within their boundaries, these were very weak departments in the sense of being able to affect industrial conduct in any significant way, and people would always threaten to move if you pushed them too hard. And so when I came to the federal government and EPA started, it was my impression that what we needed to do was centralize the enforcement power of the governments over environmental problems, and there would be no place to hide. There wouldn't be any sort of safe harbor for these people to go to where they would not be followed by the government. In fact, when I was in Indiana, George Wallace was then the governor of Alabama. He would advertise in the Indiana newspaper saying, "Come on down to Alabama. We don't care what you do to our water. We want jobs. We want industrial growth." And the governor would complain about what we were doing to try to push forward on environmental problems. So it was a weak system. And I thought if you centralized all that, and that was the attitude of the Congress at the same time. I mean, I remember Senator Baker, Senator Muskie, who were then part of the Public Works Committee, Environment and Public Works Committee, would agree that is the problem. The states aren't any good at enforcing these laws because they compete too strongly for industry's location. But so we centralized the authority over standard setting enforcement. The command and control system was set up at the central level, but a lot of the responsibility was delegated back to the states, and the states were, depending on which states you were talking about, at varying degrees of sophistication and political will to really enforce these laws. But with the federal government overseeing them and making that original delegation of authority back to them under the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, they were pretty good. They were very mad about EPA's existence at the beginning. I went around and talked to the state agencies directors at the time. I remember coming out here to the state of Washington. The guy was furious. This was a comment on his performance as the person in charge of the water agency at the time. And even though he knew that they weren't as good as they should have been because there wasn't enough public support for what they were doing, he was still resentful of the fact that here comes the central government in telling me what to do. Now, most of that is history. Most of that is gone. But there still is some tension between the states and federal governments. And I think the states, being closer to the problem, like some of these issues of non-point source pollution we were talking about, should be better at dealing with them than the federal government is. But they're not always better. To the person living in the Skagit River, which is just north of here, in Mount Vernon, Washington, a state enforcement agency looks a lot like a Washington enforcement agency to him. It's not all that much different. So by pushing some kinds of problems, not all by any means, but some kinds of environmental problems down to the people who are going to be impacted by the necessary changes, and figuring out a way to get them on your side is really worth trying. And where it works, it really is magical, and it's deserving of a lot of attention. But it doesn't, it doesn't work for every problem. It's not going to work for climate change or something of that nature, where you've got even problems like acid rain. It's just where you have multiple states and multiple regions involved. You've got to centralize the authority to deal with that, in my judgment. But where some of these problems, we're just going to make more progress by decentralizing. It's sort of counterintuitive to what I learned when we started, which was you've got to centralize this stuff to get people to pay any attention, because they'll threaten to leave, or they're too powerful at the local level to be brought under control. But I think that's not true. I think that when people sit down and they understand, I've seen them, I've sat through so many of these meetings and watched a farmer sitting on one side, environmentalists sitting on the other, who wouldn't talk to each other when you started. And after a while, the environmentalists will say, well, how about doing this? Well, if that's what you want, okay, I can do that. And the farmer will turn to the environmentalist and says, what is it you're trying to accomplish? I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish. And sometimes they'd have trouble articulating that. But when they're forced to finally say what we need is cooler water, more shade, we need more habitat for these fish that's being destroyed by the way you're farming right up next to the bank. And if sometimes for the farmer that can be a substantial expense. That's not for free that they're being asked to do this. Even so, if approached properly, they often will take the steps necessary to protect the environment. They think of themselves as stewards of the land, and to have somebody from the government come in and tell them how to manage the land is sort of inherently offensive to them, and we don't understand that because we haven't seen it from the other people's perspective.
In your conversation about states, you also mentioned Congress. You also mentioned those magical words and people there that were involved. Once again, if you would think through your history, how were you dealing with Congress when you were the first administrator of EPA, when EPA was just being formed and obviously there were multiple committees? And then talk about the second time you were the administrator of EPA and whether or not that changed, and then talk about now.
Well, the first time, my relationship, I would say, with the most important committee, and I wouldn't have said that if I was still there, but the most important committee was Muskie's committee, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And it was a very collegial group. They worked very closely together. Senator Baker was the ranking member and Senator Muskie was the chairman. And there were a number of well-known senators from both parties involved. And they prided themselves on coming up with legislative address to problems that they all agreed on, that they unanimously supported. That would not be true today, to say the least. And since these problems had sort of, it's unfair to say they sprung up on the country, but to the general public's consciousness, during the 1960s, late 60s in particular, and 70s, early 70s, they really became aware of the environment. We had rivers on fire and people couldn't see each other in Los Angeles. I mean, we had terrible pollution problems. And they knew they had to deal with them. And so, the president himself was not environmentalist. I mean, he didn't run. He never had been part of any campaign he was part of, as far as I could tell. So he was wondering, where did all this stuff come from? Why is the public so riled up? But he responded. He did submit Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act amendments to the Congress. He vetoed the Clean Water Act, but all the rest of what he submitted passed. Not exactly in the form he submitted it, but it passed. Now, my relationship with the Congress was an important one as far as I was concerned, because I had to convince Muskie, who was very likely to be the president's opponent in 1970 when EPA was first created, that we were serious about this, that we were going to work hard at enforcing these laws that had been passed, and that what I remember going up and talking to Senator Baker and Senator Muskie saying, look, these are massive pieces of legislation. There are bound to be things in here that can be improved or that aren't going to work exactly as we had anticipated. So what I will do is try as best I can to enforce these laws, come up and tell you where we have problems that need to be adjusted, and if we can agree on them, then we'll get them through and make the laws work better. They both thought that was a very good idea. I would come up and talk to Muskie in particular, and Baker not quite as often, but almost as often, about the issues we were having, what we needed to do to adjust the laws. And we had collected a whole lot of recommended amendments to these laws over the course of the first year and a half of EPA's existence. And then the presidential campaign intervened, and people changed, members of Congress changed. And so some of this, and in fact, I changed jobs. I went to the FBI. So some of this was not as successful as I'd hoped it would be if we sort of stayed in the same place long enough.
But why did they even begin to trust you? This is one of the most turbulent times in the history of the United States. You're talking about now pre-Watergate times. You're talking about You know, the person that you're dealing with, likely to be a presidential candidate, you were appointed by Presidential Nixon. What special attribute did you bring that in fact these very diverse, very political people trusted you?
Well, I don't know. I may not be the one to answer that question, but my approach to them was to try to just ensure openness. Is that we're not trying to hide anything from you, and if I had a problem, I'd come up and tell them this is a problem. If I would encourage them to call me if somebody called and complained about not doing something that we were supposed to be doing. Tell me, and they may be right. Maybe we're not enforcing the law in some part of the country, or we're not pursuing as vigorously as we should some part of the law. And it may be because we don't have enough money. It may be because we're not doing the right thing. But I need to know this, and they were good about that. I mean, they would call. We had a very sort of open, honest relationship, recognizing that in the middle of a presidential campaign that Muskie himself was engaged in, it wasn't conducive to sort of openness between the administration and the Congress. I mean, I stayed out of that political arena. I wasn't out lambasting him or anybody else. He wasn't the nominee ultimately, but I wasn't out doing that sort of thing, which makes it easier to have that kind of relationship. But I think it's so important, and the members of Congress they were very proud of the fact that they worked together as a committee and that they didn't second guess one another, and there wasn't a whole lot of finger pointing and kind of gotcha hearings going on all the time. There was some of that. There were so many different committees that we reported to, but that committee in the Senate and John Dingell's committee in the House, and there was another one that emphasized water. I can't even remember the name of it now, but it was also John Blatnick was the chairman of that committee. It was a very important one to us.
The second time that you returned to EPA as the administrator, I would think we would all have to say was one of the lowest possible moments in the history of Environmental Protection Agency, particularly in its relationships with Congress. There had been contempt actions coming out of Congress, and you're walking into that low moment. Now I'm talking specifically, how was that in your relationship with Congress, and how did you try to affect what I'm sure was very difficult opening moments?
Yeah, well, in the first instance, restoring the morale of the agency was important. Their morale had really been shattered by the way they had been treated by Ann Burford, who was the original appointment of President Reagan. She believed, from her background, which was as a member of the House of Representatives of Colorado, and she was an attorney in the local Bell Telephone Company. She believed that the agency was full of enemies, that there were people who didn't like her and didn't like what she was trying to do and didn't like Republicans. And so the signal that she and her counterparts, who were presidential appointees, sent to the agency was, you're the enemy. Well, you don't do that for a week until you're right. You treat somebody like the enemy in any institution, I don't care whether it's EPA or any place else, they'll respond in kind. So what was going on there was really terrible. I mean, it was worse than it looked from outside, in the sense of the staff and the political appointees being antagonistic to one another. So writing that, and there were 13 presidential appointees. We started with 5, but it was 13 by the time I came back 10 years later. Only 1 stayed out of the 13, and 12 were let go almost immediately. And we got the one deal I made with the president in coming back was, I said, look, we've got to get some good people in here. I haven't watched it that carefully, but I know you don't have the right people there. And if I have to go through this presidential approval process in the White House, it'll be forever getting these people approved. This was in May of 1970 or 1983, and the president looked at me and he said, "Well, go ahead. Obviously, we don't know what we're doing." That was in a sort of disarmingly honest way. And he lived up to that. We got all 12 people approved within 45 days. And I think there was only one dissenting vote in the Senate from all those people. And they were all very good people whom I'd known before and had met over the years and who were available and willing to come back. And that did a lot to stabilize the agency and stabilize the morale of the agency. And then in terms of Congress, your original question, I spent a lot of time in Congress with John Dingell in particular. I would go about every 10 days and sit down and talk to him and listen to what his complaints were about how the agency was performing. And he had a lot of them, but my relationship was very open and honest with him. The same thing on the Senate side. It was more difficult on the Senate side because the Senate wasn't as receptive. The Senate was Republican then and wasn't as receptive to changes. What I had hoped in going back in 1983 is if we could get the agency stabilized and over the trauma of what had happened, that there were things that needed to be done to make these laws work better, and that if we could have a good working relationship with the Congress, maybe we could get it done. And I think the atmosphere between the Senate and the White House had become so poisonous. And it was the Republicans were in charge of the Senate then. They were in the majority. That it just wasn't possible. I had very frank conversations with Senator Stafford, who was then the chairman of that Senate Public Works Committee. And it became apparent to me that the trauma was so great as a result of all these things that were going on that they just weren't very receptive to changes, particularly changes emanating from the administration. So after the election, I just left again.
But now we're dealing with some similarities to that time period in the sense that we have the Congress split between Democrats and Republicans. We have, a president in power. Do you see it's more of the same? And is there, a way out of this?
It's different. It's different in that the attacks on the agency itself are not the same thing that was occurring in the early 80s. These are attacks on the very agency itself. Some presidential candidates are calling for its abolition, are calling for its significant diminution in its authority to issue regulations to do what previous Congresses have mandated that they do under these Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. I think it's a result primarily of a shift in public opinion. I think these laws originally that emanated from the Nixon administration, for instance, were a result of public opinion. It wasn't a result of his own initiative. The public is really out in front of the president. I recently made a talk about Teddy Roosevelt and his era in the environment, not in EPA, but as a president. And he was out in front of the public, way out in front of the public, on what should be done about protecting wild things in the environment. And with Nixon, it was just the opposite. The purpose of my talk was, what difference does it make? Is the environment going to be improved regardless of if the president leads or if the public leads? I concluded, the only thing I can conclude actually was it would be more fun working for somebody who believed in what you were doing than somebody who felt they were forced into it. But I think today the attitude of the public, primarily I think as a result of economic downturn, but not exclusively, some of it is the issues themselves affect a much broader swath of the public than they did earlier, is not as nearly as supportive of protecting the environment and protecting public health as they once were. They are in the theoretical level. When it comes right down to practice, they're less supportive. Otherwise, these presidential candidates wouldn't be saying these things. It's the same thing with the Congress. The Republicans in the Congress are really taking on these regulatory agencies head on. That would not have happened in the decades leading up to this century. Because fundamentally the public was concerned about its health, concerned about environmental protection, and they wouldn't politically permit these members of Congress or even candidates for president to get away with saying what they are. Now, you've seen the Republicans say, we want to review each regulation that EPA puts out and say yay or nay. They wouldn't do that 30 days and they'd be happy to give it back to EPA. I mean, you make so many people mad every time you do one of these things. And that isn't what congressmen like to do. So I don't think that's a viable solution. And I don't think in the last analysis they're going to abolish it either. If they want to take a look at the laws, figure out a way to make them work better, make them more consistent with all the needs that society has, fine, I'm all for that. But to talk about abolishing EPA, we've got 16 major statutes EPA administers. Who's going to do that? Are they going to abolish the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Pesticide Law, the Clean Water Act? I don't think so. I think that's more talk than action.
I'm going to move you now from Congress to environmental groups. The revolution, the environmental creation in the late 60s and early 70s also spawned environmental groups, and you have a well-known reputation for working collaboratively with most of them. How do you see their role in the formation of environmental law? Where do you see that going?
Well, it's like any time. I think the environmental movement was created along with the civil rights movement, the women's movement, all as a result of a lot of legitimate concerns on very visible, big-time problems. And they were initially very successful in getting legislation to deal with the most obvious of the problems. Then you go through a sort of a second phase in which the problems are not quite so obvious and not quite so uniformly embraced by the public, and it gets to be a more contentious period. But the environmental groups were very successful in getting their initial desires met and addressing legitimate problems. I mean, these laws that we've talked about here, the major pieces of legislation, were a result in large part directly of them doing a lot of work with the Congress, with the staff on the Hill, to put these laws in place, and they were very successful initially in doing that. I think if there's a change that needs to be made, we need to deal with the environment with man as a part of it. We sort of thought of wilderness areas were an example of let's keep man out completely of these areas so that they don't contaminate them with their presence. And man's contaminating presence sort of was reinforced by what happened in the great civilized areas of the world with water and air pollution that often resulted from inattention to what was being done to make those areas work. Now, as we move forward, we've got to figure out a way to harmonize man's legitimate concerns, and we can argue about what those are, but man's concerns with rules necessary to protect health and the environment. And I think of freedom fundamentally as a system of restraints, not the absence of restraint, which is license. And the environmental groups, I think, need to, and some of them already are, gravitate more toward understanding how to meet man's legitimate desires and aspirations with protecting the environment. It isn't man versus the environment, it's man and the environment. And it's just sort of like we were talking about these watersheds, these river basins. If we don't figure out a way to accommodate the man's interest in those, and it's all men who live there, interest in those watersheds, we're not going to restore them. It's just, I think it's just that simple. And I do think environmental groups need to help provide the intellectual capital stock that will show us how to do that. we're still struggling mightily with how to accommodate man's presence here on Earth with all the other living things that we share the Earth with. In my lifetime, John, I was born in 1932. There were just over 2 billion people on Earth from the beginning of all of us, 2 billion people. Last summer, we passed 7 billion people. Not only are there more of us, there's more technology, there's more real wealth in the world, although we don't always feel like there is. But if you take the accumulation of wealth that's taking place in the developing world, China, India, and Brazil, places like that, our capability of having an impact on the environment is increasing much faster than our population is. And at some point, we're going to have to figure out how all of these people are going to be able to live and prosper along with other living things that we share the space with. And it's a hard issue, hard problem, and we haven't figured it out yet. But the environmental groups have a lot to say in all this and have a lot to offer to it, I think. And I think they can step back and look at what happened historically, and a lot of the facts that the air is cleaner and the water is cleaner today than it was 40 years ago are a result of their efforts and their work. I don't think they need to be discouraged about it. They should take hope from it.
If I have to pick a few words to describe you, Bill, it would be almost legendary manager, effective leader, and a person of high personal integrity. And I'm about to ask you a question about each one of those attributes that I just described of you. And so the first one is manager. You actually take over with the assistance of the Attorney General, then John Mitchell, to be the first administrator of EPA, but many, I think, dozen diverse agencies and many people coming together. What was that like, and what do we learn from that, management-wise?
Well, when EPA was created, it was created under the Executive Reorganization Act, which, by the way, doesn't exist anymore, and it's a shame it doesn't, because you could create a cabinet or not a cabinet, but a sub-cabinet level agency, or move boxes around between different departments and agencies of government. As long as the Congress didn't veto it in 60 days, it became law. We badly need that in our government today. And it lapsed in the Reagan administration, and I must confess I'm not even sure why it lapsed. I think any president would endorse that sort of thing. So what they did to create EPA was take 15 agencies and pieces of agencies and put them under one umbrella, and call it the Environmental Protection Agency, submitted it in the form of a plan to the Congress, and if the Congress didn't veto it, which they didn't, in 60 days, it became law. If the Congress had to do it itself, it never would have happened. But they had to take an affirmative act to veto it, and that meant that all the committee chairmen who wanted to maintain their power over these other agencies and pieces of agencies would have to agree to let loose of it and create one new agency. Wouldn't have happened. So what did you do? Well, I was 38 years old when this happened. I had been the chief counsel in the Indiana Attorney General's office and had run a law office, the civil division in the Justice Department, of about 300 lawyers. And so that gave me some management experience, but nothing like what I faced. I had not been to business school. I'd gone to law school. And I remember the first time our manager, he was a guy that came over from Office of Management and Budget to run the administrative side of the agency, said, now here are all the boxes that we've inherited, and it's up to you to decide where they go. I had never seen an organization chart in my life. I didn't have any. I said, look, you got to help me here. I can't do this by myself. So I really had some very good help. And I sort of got the sense in the first 4 to 5 months of the agency's existence that we had a limited amount of time in which we had to straighten this out and let people know where they fit and who their boss was and how they were supposed to behave in terms of the structure of the whole. And it was almost a tension between that need that people have to kind of see where they fit in the overall scheme of things and doing it as right as we knew how to do it at the limited amount of time we had. the tension between those two had to finally result in a decision as to how we were going to manage the agency. And I got some help from the Office of Management and Budget in doing that, and had some very good people in the agency who understood government management, who could help me as well. I just sort of learned as going. You not only have to manage the internal aspects of the agency itself, but the relationships with the Congress, the relationship with the White House, with the Office of Management and Budget, and with other agencies. We were affecting every agency in government. I mean, if the Department of Interior wanted to approve or not approve a pipeline, we would comment under the National Environmental Policy Act on whether this was a good idea or not. And all of a sudden there'd be me disagreeing in the front page of the New York Times with Rogers Morton, who was the head of the Department of Interior, and he'd call up and say, "What are you doing talking? You had no idea where these laws came from." So I had a lot of problems within the central government itself in terms of what our responsibilities were. And then we had to show the public that we were serious about enforcing these laws. And it seemed to me we needed to take on some big cities, we needed to take on some big industries, and show them that the public had demanded something be done about pollution. Here was an agency of government that was going to try to be responsive to the government's or to the public's demand. And so while trying to get it organized internally and at the same time taking these external steps, I'll tell you one thing, it was very exciting. I had no trouble getting up in the morning and going to work, and it was, to me, very energizing to have all these sort of new responsibilities. As you suggest, it's only about every 15 years or so that one of these new agencies comes along, and to be there at the beginning was a huge challenge.
Bill, I have to ask because Bob Perciasepi told me I need to ask you about national ambient air quality standards. Bob, who had been now as deputy administrator, but had been the assistant administrator for air in his life, told me the story that when you arrived, you had a whole inbox full of national ambient air quality standards that you had to promulgate in just a few months.
Yeah, well, we actually had fewer time than that. The Clean Air Act passed in December 1st of 1970. We opened our doors on December 9th, 8 days after it passed. We had 60 days to issue 6 ambient air quality standards. And they had been prepared in advance by the Department of HEW, which was where the National Ambient Air or National Air Pollution Control Agency was. It came over to EPA, and the statute, the Clean Air Act, passed by the Congress, signed by the President, mandated that we issue these standards in 60 days. And I was told by the man who was managing this for the Department of HEW, who came over with the transfer, these are all decided. The Congress understands them. The White House understands them. The Office of Management and Budget. Well, I did have enough sense to check with these people in any event. Congress said they're very serious about the 60-day period. We want to see these out. The White House wasn't paying much attention to it. Well, when we issued them, and this is something the White House had no idea was true, the President didn't, that we were not to take into account any cost. We were simply to issue them on the basis of health. And so, we were to issue the standard and then a margin of safety below it, so that the standard would be the threshold where nobody would be harmed physically or their health wouldn't be harmed, and then a margin of safety below it. So the standards were very stringent. And we had a rationale in the statute or in the submission of the standards themselves that matched the statute. All hell broke loose when we issued them. I mean, the people were saying we're going out of business. There's no way we can meet these standards in the time frame. And I remember going over to see the President, told him what I'd done, why we'd done it. He wasn't paying any attention, and all these people suddenly started calling and saying how terrible everything was going to be. And I said, we'll administer these laws as wisely as we know how. And the states now have to adopt state implementation plans that show how they're going to meet these standards. So there are steps that need to be taken. And in some of these steps, cost can be taken into account. It was just the initial standard in which no cost could be taken into account. Now everybody understands what happens when you issue a new standard. They know there are significant implications to the economy as well as potentially to human health. So it's more complicated and more difficult to get them out than it was then. And part of the reason we made so much progress at the end is we didn't know what we were doing. we issued a lot of this stuff in response to the mandates we had from Congress. But I mean, I'd have to be honest with you, I didn't have any idea the effect these things would have on the whole economy of this country. And it was a huge effect.
I want to move now to your second time as administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, where the EPA had recently taken a body blow to their existence with congressional hearings and even criminal actions with the combination of Ann Gorsuch and Rita Lavelle and stories of hit lists for government employees that were in the agency at that time. And now you are asked to come back and restore morale. And that's leadership. How did you do it? How did you turn the agency around, which everyone agrees that you did? But how?
The second time around in 1983, I don't think it was as tough as it looked. First time it was tougher than it looked. And the second time around, all we needed to do was assure the agency that the people in the agency they're respected, that we knew they were trying to do the best job they could to carry out the mandate they had from the Congress as well as the responsibilities in the agency, and let them know that you were going to rely on them to make judgments about what steps should be taken to carry out your mission, and get good people in there to help them, to lead them. And that's what it took. They needed to know that in the first place, the bureaucracy it takes so many body blows from so many different directions. It's even more true today than it was then. That people sort of develop this battered agency syndrome, where they think everybody's going to beat up on them no matter what they do, and it kind of gives them a complex almost about their work, and they need to be assured that their people respect them, that they're hired to do a job and they're doing the job. And yeah, you make some people mad doing it, but you've got to keep doing it. And by the way, you don't have to make everybody mad. You can treat people like citizens that they are, and still move the whole thing forward. And they responded terrifically, I thought. I mean, I think the morale was turned around almost right away, just because they knew things were going to get better, and they did. And they felt good about going to work in the morning and not beleaguered like they had before.
But you had significant issues to deal with, controversial issues, like, for instance, pesticide issues. Did you have the workforce with you as you were making those decisions and facing those controversies?
You can get the workforce with you if you rely on them, and you ask for their input, and you ask for it honestly. You really wanted them to know, in the case of a pesticide, it's a risk-benefit weighing process. That's the way the pesticide law deals with it. First of all, you want the scientist to tell you what's the nature of the risk, and nature of the risk in the way in which we're using it now. And don't cook any data. I don't want data cooked one way or the other. Just tell me honestly, what do we know about the risk and what don't we know, and then we'll decide with the policy people what we should do about it. And that was it's fairly straightforward. And we had ethylene dibromide was a problem we had here, which the agriculture department called over. Here were a bunch of grocers all in a state of panic that the health inspectors were pulling Aunt Jemima's cake mix and other stuff off the shelves because it was contaminated with this what was found to be a carcinogen. We got that all straightened out. I said, nobody's ever called me over to the agriculture department and asked me to do anything except get off their land. You guys are now saying you're in real trouble. So we took 35 days and did an intensive scientific study of the nature of the problem and bled it out of all the systems that were then being used. And it was a grain fumigant primarily. That's how it got into these cake mixes and things. But there was another thing I did that I'd almost forgotten about that was important. A lot of the criticism of the Burford year and a half that she was in EPA had to do with the science. They said they were forcing the scientists to come up with findings that weren't what they really believed. And that is, you absolutely can never do that in one of these government agencies. Whatever the science is what it is. It says there's a risk, then you've got to deal with the risk. Or not deal with it if you think you can get away with telling the public you're not going to deal with the risk. At any rate, I went over to talked to Frank Press, who was then the head of the National Academy of Sciences. I said, I wonder if you would convene a group of scientists and let me talk to them about how we're going to run this agency and how the relationship between risk and benefits should be properly weighed and what their role is in trying to figure out how to help us by identifying the risk. And they had just come out with what they called a red book that differentiated between risk assessment and risk management. The risk assessment was the scientific part of the equation. The risk management was what's the nature of the problem and what's causing it. The third part of it was the management. What should you do about it? How should we do this? And so I made this speech to him about how he had to distinguish between the two and that we were going to make sure that they were respected in what they found and that we were going to properly discharge our responsibilities in managing these risks. That had a big impact on Congress. There are a number of congressmen who came. We invited a lot of them to come to the speech, and they couldn't quarrel with it because that's what the agency's supposed to do, is kind of what I was spelling out. But it did a lot to sort of calm people down and get them feeling like, well, something may happen good here yet.
So I've asked you about management because of your well-renowned reputation as an extraordinary manager. Now leadership, now I want to do one attribute of both, and that is personal integrity, which many people, myself included, associate with you, which means I draw you to the events of 1973. So you leave now the Environmental Protection Agency, and you find yourself back at Department of Justice, first as the acting head of FBI and then as the Deputy Attorney General. And you and the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, get presidential directions that you don't agree with. So now I want to know about personal integrity. I want to know what happened and what lessons do all of us learn from that in terms of keeping faith with our own personal ideals.
It's a little hard for me to talk about this, but you've asked me, so I will. I come into the high levels of American government, or any place in the American government, really. You've got to tell yourself there are lines over which I won't step. I mean, in the case of myself, you mentioned the FBI and the Deputy Attorney General. The FBI, the president asked me to go over and become the director, and I told him I didn't want to do that. It had never been a burning ambition of mine to chase federal criminals around the rest of my life, but that I would go over and occupy the chair until we could find a successor. Gray had destroyed some documents and had acknowledged that to the Senate committee, and so the president withdrew his nomination. This was in April of 1973, and he asked me to become the director of the FBI, and so I told him we'd do it on an interim basis until we could find a permanent, and he finally agreed to that. And at the same time, Archibald Cox was appointed special prosecutor, and Elliot Richardson was appointed the Attorney General. I was actually there for about a week before Cox showed up, and then for another 3 weeks before Richardson was confirmed. He had to agree to appoint Cox as special prosecutor before the Senate would confirm him in his job. And we then, through that period, I was running the Watergate investigation and was daily meeting with Cox in order to assign agents to chase down leads he needed. I had known Cox in law school. I was in his class at Harvard. I reminded him when we first met that he once told me to get my feet off the desk in his in his class, and he I don't think he was as amused as I was about it. At any rate, we had a very good relationship, and I think we were both determined to carry out our responsibilities as best we could. He in particular, because he had been Solicitor General in the Kennedy administration, he was worried about being seen as on some kind of political vendetta against the president. He was scrupulous in staying away from areas that he shouldn't have. I would be called occasionally by the White House, not by the president, but by Al Haig, who was the chief of staff, and asked to tell Cox to back off some area that his people were getting into had nothing to do with the Watergate. And I told him I'd pass on that desire, but I wasn't going to order him to do it because I wasn't in charge of the investigation, he was. And in every instance that I took up one of those issues with him, Cox backed off. He said, we don't want to get into it. And he had a lot of hard chargers working for him in that office. And he'd pull them back and stay away. So as far as I was concerned, he was scrupulous in trying to stick to his knitting, stick to the assignment that he had, what it was involved in this Watergate break-in, to what extent was the White House involved, if at all, and stay out of these other issues that came up from time to time. Well, then I became the Deputy Attorney General in September of 1973. I had been a special assistant to Elliot Richardson when he was Attorney General, and that summer we spent the whole summer in the Agnew investigation. The Vice President was accepting bribes, some of them in the basement of the White House, and the grand jury had been convened in Baltimore to look into all of that, and we ended up in the first part of October. I had been in office about two weeks, with Agnew submitting a affidavit admitting to countless crimes that he'd committed while he was governor, and then even while he was still vice president, there were people giving him money in return for favors he'd granted him in the past. And the president appointed the next day Gerald Ford to take his place. And I remember I was going out to Grand Rapids to oversee the FBI investigation. They'd sent 75 people out there, FBI agents, to talk to everybody that ever known Ford to make sure that they were discharging their responsibilities. Both houses had to approve Ford under the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. So I remember sticking my head in the door and saying, I've got to go out to Grand Rapids. There's places in furor over all these agents charged around there. And Richardson said, we've got a worse problem than Agnew. And I said, well, that's not possible. Who could that be? He said, well, they want to fire Cox. The White House, the president wants to fire Cox. And this was on a Monday. And I said, well, don't worry about that. They'll never do that. The American people wouldn't tolerate it if they tried. I was right about that part. I wasn't right about that they wouldn't fire him. But again, when I went out to Grand Rapids, I was in constant contact with the White House, with the Attorney General, and the situation was getting worse and worse. And so I came back on Wednesday, which was much earlier than I had intended, and it was clear that the White House wanted to discharge Cox. And Richardson was trying hard to work it out. He tried to get Senator Stennis to summarize the tapes. The question was over the tapes. Would the president turn over the tapes to Cox? Because once he found out through interviews that some of the White House staff was saying there was a conspiracy going on, if there were tapes of these conversations, obviously he wanted to see those. And he ultimately prevailed in the Supreme Court to get the tapes, but he had a Court of Appeals opinion at the time that ordered the president to turn the tapes over to him. There were 9 relevant tapes that they were seeking at the time. And the president didn't want to give him those tapes. So Richardson, Cox turned down the Stennis approach. He did not agree not to continue to pursue the tapes, and he told Richardson and me the night before that on that Saturday he was going to call a press conference and announce that he wasn't going to turn over the tapes. And so we listened to him in the Attorney General's office. When he was finished, the president called the Attorney General and asked him to come over and see him. And he did, and when he came back, he was telling us, this was about 5 in the afternoon, he was telling us what happened. My secretary said that Al Haig is on the phone and wants to talk to you. My office was right underneath the Attorney General's office. So I went down and I told him I couldn't discharge him either. I'd been thinking about it all week, and it just seemed to me that Cox was doing nothing wrong. Maybe he was getting too close to what had actually happened, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. So he didn't discharge. He didn't deserve to be fired, and so I refused. And then sent my resignation over along with Richardson. And that night, it was announced that I'd been fired along with Cox. And the next day, the president announced that my resignation and Richardson had both been accepted. So I can claim to be fired and resign both. I often have, depending on the audience. It was the problem, in my judgment, was that unless the president, to whom you owe a duty, if the president appoints you, you owe him a duty of loyalty, and it's not something you take loosely. You're not going to win every fight. You weren't elected; he was. That's the whole point. If you say, I think we should do this, and he has the authority to make the judgment, it's because you don't win, you don't quit. You try to accommodate your own desires with his. In this case, what he was asking me to do, I thought was fundamentally wrong. I don't think you fire the man who's been hired. You've agreed with the Senate to hire to investigate you, and primarily because he was getting too close to you. And I didn't want to be the instrument of the exercise of the president's power to do that. And I mentioned at the beginning that I thought there are lines over which you don't step. I would have been clear over the line in this case, as far as I was concerned. I don't think it's possible to try to define those lines ahead of time. I think you have to look at the situation that you're involved in and what you know about it and what you're being asked to do, and then act accordingly. I didn't think it was a hard decision, to be honest with you. I thought it was very clear why he was doing it and why he was asking me to do it, and I just didn't think it was appropriate.
After that event, you returned to law practice, and then ultimately to corporations, where you have now served as vice president and as CEO and chair, and you've been on the boards of a number of corporations. Where do they fit? Where does the advancement, where does the innovation, where is the creativity going on in corporations then and now? Where does that fit in our future?
It's crucial. If we don't innovate, and in the first place, corporations have got to see themselves differently than I believe they do now. I don't think they see themselves as responsible. I mean, if they want to take that citizens case in the Supreme Court, which says they can contribute to any candidates through a super PAC as much as they want, that gives them responsibilities as citizens to do that. These super PACs are terrible, the stuff they put out. They pay no attention. I hope they're not paying attention, because if they are, then they're even more culpable to the stuff they put out in these campaigns. They pay no attention to the truth. They just pour in all kinds of slander and libel on top of these candidates, and a lot of them, they're funded by individuals, and they're also funded by corporations. And corporations, to the extent that they're considered as citizens of this society, have a responsibility to the society to make it work. And if there are, for instance, if a corporation is polluting the water, and they're arguing, well, we can't stop polluting the water because if we did so, it would cost the corporation so much that we couldn't continue to compete, then argue in favor of rules that cause everybody to do the same thing and not just you. And let's try to make those rules as reasonable as we can. We don't want to push people on behalf of de minimis or even no risk to the point where they can't continue to compete. That doesn't make any sense or continue to function. But these corporations have a responsibility to act like citizens, and to the extent they don't, and a lot of them don't, then you've got to regulate them, and they've got to be. The rules have got to be there that keep the society's values and norms intact when these people are operating, when corporations are managing the way they are. The environment's, I mean, the financial regulation is clear with the last two bubble bursts we've had and the recessions that have followed. What happens to the society when people aren't subject to reasonable regulation? Same time with the environment, the public health or the environment can be adversely affected if these corporations don't do the right thing, and they need to be hammered if they don't by the government, I think. Now, you know, there are EPA horror stories where EPA has gone too far with some of these companies, and that happens. And I mean, I think it is kind of a chicken and egg. The worse corporations perform, the more they're going to get beaten up by those responsible for enforcing rules and regulations. And if you want to know where these financial regulations come from, they come from bad performance in the past. If you have something like Enron or these things that occurred back in the late 90s, or the housing bubbles and other things that have burst with all these securities they issued that don't have any value to them, and nobody's saying, they want to know, well, why are you imposing all these rules on us? Because the members of Congress go home and somebody points out that some guy making a $100 million bonus is also on top of an organization cheating people out of their life savings by issuing securities that aren't any value. The congressman isn't, with somebody's microphone stuck under their head, isn't going to say, I'm not going to do anything about that, because I think the free enterprise system should go along the way it is without anybody interfering with it. I mean, he'd be an ex-congressman within the next election, and should be. And because of the complexity of this society, the more you need to regulate in order to keep conduct appropriate, the more you distort in many ways. You say, can we solve land use problems by issuing regulations? I don't think so. I don't know what the regulation is going to look like. You've got to get that landowner to believe that he lives in a community and he's got a responsibility to that community or to the water that other people are using for things other than what he's using it for, that he doesn't make it unusable for them. That is such a stronger motivation than believing somebody's going to come from somewhere to grab them. Now, the bigger corporations are a lot more vulnerable than the average citizen. That doesn't mean the average citizen can't point to instances where there has been abuse to them, when we started EPA, it may have looked harder to enforce against these big corporations. I didn't think it was. There wasn't any sympathy for them in the public. The big cities that were discharging raw sewage into the rivers all over the country, there was very little sympathy for them. But now where you've got much smaller enterprises, even individual landowners being affected by government action, there's a lot of sympathy for them. And it's a lot harder for government to impose restrictions on them that make sense. So that's kind of the dilemma I see us in right now. As there are more people, and where there's more wealth, and there's more technology, how does government function in a way that maintains the trust of the public so that they can continue to function, and at the same time imposes reasonable rules on people that guide corporate and individual conduct?
Where do you stand on the role of environmental enforcement?
So it's needed, because there are people who won't pay any attention to matter. I mean, I believe in people sitting down and reasoning together and trying to figure out what the right solution is. Some people don't do that, and the government has got to intervene. In the case of a corporation who may be discharging air pollution or water pollution, depending on what their manufacturing or other kind of process might be, they need enforcement in order to compete. You can't ask only one guy to do something and say we're not going to bother your competitors. That's terribly unfair. You've got to make it as uniform as you can, as reasonable as you can, and make sure that you understand the cost of what you're doing, and the cost can sometimes be associated with the pace, what the environmental and public health improvements are that can be promised as a result of these steps. And those are complicated formulas, easy to figure out, and reasonable people can differ on where you ought to come out. But as long as you're trying to come out in the right place, and the people working on it are trying to treat people fairly who might be affected by it, then you've got the best system that you can conceive of. And it's, right now that I think one of the central problems our country has is that this erosion of trust that's taken place. And if people don't trust the government to try to do the right thing, it really makes it hard for free societies to work.
We've been talking about the current status of environmental law and policy in the United States. What shortcomings do you see in our current system, either by the system itself or by substantive issues? What shortcomings exist?
Yeah, I think we've not figured out yet how to deal with these non-point source pollution problems, which are, in the case of water, the most obvious and the most difficult to get at, because we've got these large bodies of water which we haven't been able to improve very successfully, and I don't think our current system sort of works very well. The kind of top-down and standard-set enforcement process, and we need to rethink about how we do that. We need more examples of how to do it successfully at places like watersheds. And we're organized along ways that don't pay any attention to watersheds. We got counties, cities drawing boundaries that have nothing to do with watersheds. And clearly a better way to manage water is manage it through the watershed. And there's some places where that's happened and where it's been very successful. But I'm not so optimistic as to think we're going to change the way we've constructed our governmental systems in the country, our governmental geography in the country to encompass watersheds, although it would be a better way to manage a watershed.
We have discussed your history as an administrator twice now, and you've described a process by which you were able to meet with senators and congressmen from the other party. You were able to meet regularly with first Senator Muskie and then Congressman John Dingell and achieve resolution of key issues, and some of the product was legislation that was passed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities. We seem to have lost some of that. Is that accurate, and is there a way for us to return to a period where in fact we could achieve bipartisan consensus on some of these major issues still facing the country, like non-point source?
Yeah, I think the answer is that yes, we can. It certainly is harder today than it used to be, and I think it still also is dependent on individuals. If an individual will work very hard at trying to accommodate the Congress's interest and figure out ways to try to solve these problems, particularly if they're not sort of day-to-day political debate sort of issues that are on the agenda constantly, it may be possible to make some progress. I mean, this Congress still passes bills from time to time on issues that people aren't paying much attention to. So, I think reasonable people can still sit down and work together on issues. It's the more visible you are. I mean, for instance, I've been working out here on Puget Sound now for the last several years, and I am absolutely committed to, as I think everybody is, just keeping it out of politics. The minute it gets into politics, it's hard enough to fix it anyway, but doing it on top of a political debate would be impossible. And so that's one way, is to try to keep it out. Now, are we going to improve the general civility of discourse at the national level and move away from the hyper-partisanship as it exists today? I don't think this year we will. I think it'll probably get worse as this campaign goes on. But maybe when the campaign's over, how the whole Congress sort of unfolds, it will improve. I mean, people say we've never had a situation like this. Well, we have too. We had a civil war back in the 19th century, and people in Congress were beating up on each other every day. I mean, literally, they were either caning each other or having fist fights. We had a sitting vice president shoot and kill a former Secretary of Treasury in 1804 when Aaron Burr, Jefferson's vice president, shot Alexander Hamilton. So we've had some serious discussions here in the past, but this is unique in my lifetime, certainly, in terms of the partisanship in Congress. And it's not healthy. I mean, my good friend Dick Lugar was recently defeated in a primary in the state of Indiana, and his opponent says he is going to Congress never to compromise, never to back away from a principle. I hope he doesn't mean that. I mean, backing away from a principle, of course, is not something that's very popular to do. On the other hand, compromise is absolutely necessary for progress in a free society, unless Republicans take over everything or the Democrats take over everything. And by everything, it means more than 60 people in the Senate, so it's not easy to do. And it's just not okay to drift along like we were, particularly in the economy. And the environment is connected with the economy. We a lot of things we badly need doing out here in the form of infrastructure. We don't have the money to do right now, or people don't think they have the money to do. And that's not good.
What about our governance structures that exist today? And by governance, I mean the institutions of the federal and state government. I mean non-government organizations, of which obviously my organization, the Environmental Law Institute, is part of. But there's also international organizations. Is that structure, as it has evolved, is that adequate for the future?
Well, I would say right now, if you look at our Congress, you'd have to say no, it's not adequate to deal with the major problems we have, not just environmental problems, but other problems. Now, what you should do with it, and how, even more importantly, I think, how you go about changing it, is not so simple. I mean, if you think the relationship, and just stay with the environment, with the state, federal, local jurisdiction, responsibility over protecting the environment should be adjusted somewhat to accommodate more to some of the problems we were discussing earlier involving non-point source pollution and the rest. How would you go about getting that change? How would you go about affecting it? Ideally, what you do in a corporation is you try it out in a couple of areas and see whether your solutions or ideas that others might have who work for you would work. And then if it did, then you try to spread it through a best practices approach throughout the rest of the organization. What we tend to do in this country is change something all at once, and the law of unintended consequences takes over, and you're bound to sort of overwhelm the system. But I think in the environment, I really believe that there's enough frustration at the state level that I've noticed recently that if reasonable people were to sit down and go over the structure we've created between the federal, state, and almost as an afterthought, local government, and how the citizen and environmental organizations and others fit in, if they all participated in the process whereby we tried to think about the structure and how we ought to change it, they would buy into it, and they would accommodate to their interest as the changes were made. So I do think there's an approach that would work. I don't think if you start it in the Congress, it'll go anywhere. There's an effort right now in the administration to reorganize the Commerce Department and to move NOAA somewhere. I was talking to the guys the other day about trying to do that. I just can't see how that would happen right now if you start with the administration suggesting it or if the Congress suggested a way to do it. You've got to get all the people that are going to be affected and say, how can we do, here's number one, here's the problem where it's located now. We need it to work better, and it would work better in a different structure. What are the options we have, and what are the pros and cons of those options? And if you did that in a very open, participative way, then you might get enough support for it to get it through Congress. Otherwise, I don't see that anything that's going to happen.
In your lifetime, what president stands out that you think had the most positive impact, and I'm not asking, with the most positive impact during his administration on the environment?
Well, there's no question about it, it was Nixon. I mean, you can argue with the world looks level, and you can't argue with the number of statutes that were passed under his administration, most of which were originally submitted by him, and invariably he felt the Congress went too far. And then he sort of became frustrated with his own record after a while because he he felt he either signed the legislation as it came to him and he didn't like it very much, or he'd veto it and appeared to be vetoing his own idea. And he did that once with the Clean Water Act right before the 1972 election. Congress overrode him overwhelmingly, even after he vetoed the Clean Water Act. He was 20 points ahead of McGovern, and still the Congress overrode him. He had an enormous effect, and you know, whether it was his idea or the public pushed him. I mean, you had people like Russell Train and John Whitaker, and to a certain extent John Ehrlichman, were very friendly to the environment, favorable to making changes, and worked hard at giving him ideas and approaches that were popular with the public because the public was demanding change. You know, a lot of people have said to me, well, isn't that terrible? The president didn't really care that much about the environment. And we said, well, so what? I mean, that's the way democracy is supposed to work. The public sees something wrong, they demand change to address it, and the president and the Congress respond. Wonderful. That's the way it's supposed to work. I mean, I'm sure everybody in Congress was wild about the idea of creating EPA. I know they weren't.
But you mentioned Russell Train, the first head of the Council on Environmental Quality, set up to be the White House, if you will, entity, different of course than the Office of Management and Budget. How was it when you were involved directly, and is that working? Is the Council on Environmental Quality, as it was originally put together, is that actually a positive part of our governance or not?
Well, I think it's a positive part of our governance. I don't think it's working quite the way it did when Train was there. He was started a year before EPA was created. And an awful lot of these statutes that came out of the administration, suggested legislation, came out of the Council on Environmental Quality. And he convened a very outstanding group of people working with him and for him at the beginning, and is really, I think, an unsung author of an awful lot of our environmental laws and rules that came along. So I mean, it was it was a brand new agency, much like EPA when it started, with a lot of excitement and a lot of people drawn to the issue as it began to unfold. And I think he did a terrific job of managing it. And it's had its ups and downs since. The Reagan administration wasn't wild about the idea. Some government in both parties have thought about abolishing CEQ, and then they see there's a constituency for it and they back away. But its heyday, its golden age was there right at the beginning.
In the past several presidential elections, certainly the last 3 or 4, it's fair to say that environmental issues were not at the forefront of the presidential debates, or even, in fact, the presidential campaigns. But if you were present, what sort of questions should we be asking of the candidates about environmental, energy, or natural resource issues?
How are you going to get it done? I think we'll have agreement on what should be done, although maybe not completely in this administration. It's so polarized. But if you take energy as an example, if the twin issues of our reliance on these very unstable parts of the world for our oil supply don't convince you that we ought to do something at least to reduce that dependence on these unstable parts of the world, like the Middle East or Russia or Venezuela or even Nigeria, then you're concerned about climate change and excessive use of fossil fuels and the impact of carbon. The combination of those two should direct public policy toward a much more aggressive effort to develop alternative forms of energy. Now the question of how are you going to get that done, that's the big presidential issue. I mean, I think this president would go along with a reasonable policy to do it without any question. And he tried cap and trade on climate change, and it would have had a similar effect on oil. And now his policy is all of the above, which doesn't strike me as a very pointed policy, at least. I think it's how to do it. I mean, I think he's got to decide it's a big priority, and he's going to talk about it. I'm on an ocean acidification panel out here. The governor's appointed a panel to look at ocean acidification. And it's another form of climate change. It's carbon going into the ocean causing excessive acidity, plus runoff from the land also contributes to it. And we're being asked, what's the nature of the problem? Well, it's causing shellfish not to form shells, which is not a good thing for shellfish, at least. And for those of us who like shellfish, it's even worse. So what should we do about it? That's our question. It's absent some global address to the issue of carbon, not an awful lot will happen. I mean, our estimate, science estimate is 17 to 25% of the problem comes from runoff from land. We've already talked about the problems of landowners and putting burdens on them. They'll just resist to be anything to try any new assignments to reduce the impact of what they do. So the state of Washington recommending that the world do something about climate change is not likely to have a big impact. But I think the president, he's got to decide how big a priority it is for him. And I've often thought that presidents who are inevitably become concerned about foreign policy because of its obvious interest to the public, and during times like this they have to be concerned about the economy, they don't have to let all those other issues go. And I'm not so sure that I would include climate change in just all those other issues. But nevertheless, he could appoint an assistant to himself, and he tried it with the czars. I think that's a bad name. But say, I would like to see this policy, let's say ocean policy, coordinated much better than it is now. And the president has created a National Ocean Council. He's issued a National Ocean Policy. And the Republicans in the House said no funding for anything that has to do with national ocean policy. Well, it's a lot easier to give the president advice as to what to do than to be there yourself and figure out how to make it happen. And I think his adoption of a national ocean policy and the creation of a National Ocean Council just makes sense. It's try to coordinate the 15 separate public, federal agencies that have significant impact on the ocean, coordinate their activity to make sure it doesn't destroy this resource so important to all of us. It makes common sense. And where these guys come off just saying we should never fund anything that has anything to do with a national ocean policy, it's baffling to me. But
my last question of you in this extraordinary interview is the future. What, in environmental protection, in environmental advancement, what concerns you in the future, and what gives you hope?
Well, what would concern me would be whether or not our apparatus for making sound public policy that affects human well-being is rapid enough to meet the pace of change. If climate change, for instance, is taking place much faster than we think, or the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere is causing problems that will affect us for 100 years or more, our ability to adjust, our human ability to adjust under the institutions we've now created for adjustment fast enough to avoid real cataclysm. I'm not predicting cataclysm because I don't know if that will happen, but we're really slower in our ability to respond to problems than the nature of the problems warrant. I think that's true of the environment. I think it's true of our economic problems now, whether it's Social Security or Medicare or whatever the issue might be. We're very good at giving the old can a kick down the road, but not very good at facing up to these problems and dealing with them. And so that gives me real pause about the future. I think our country's not moving in the direction it ought to right now on a number of fronts. We're not exercising international leadership on issues like the environment. We're not showing the kind of political will we need in these economic areas, and that's just a shame. I guess my hope is, the thing that gives me hope is are the American people themselves, who I think are remarkably adaptable and resilient and innovative, and have been historically. I think we're being affected now by some of these issues are all interconnected in my mind, and that is eroding some of that innovativeness and energy and inventiveness that we have is so crucial for our future success. But I still think it's there, and I think that I taught a class at the University of Washington the other day, and boy, oh boy, what a group of students that I talked to and how impressive they were. So that certainly gives me hope in the future.
For those of you who are listening to us, I'm going to summarize and probably not do justice to Bill Ruckelshouse's extraordinary background. Who was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, served in the Army and became a drill sergeant, and then graduated from Princeton University and Harvard Law School. He joined the family law firm, but at age 28 became a Deputy Attorney General of Indiana, where for 5 years he worked on, among other things, pollution control issues. Somewhat remarkably, he both ran for and became a member of the Indiana House of Representatives and served as the majority leader of the House, serving in that capacity from 1967 to 1969. At that stage, President Richard Nixon appointed him as the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division at the United States Department of Justice, where he served for 2 years. At that time, the Environmental Protection Agency was created on December the 2nd, 1970 by President Nixon, who in turn appointed Mr. Ruckelshaus as the first administrator. He was responsible then for forming the entirely new agency from various other government agencies and offices and launched it into the institution that it is today. In 1973, he was then chosen by the Attorney General to be the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and then later the Deputy Attorney General of the United States Department of Justice, resigning in what is now referred to as the Saturday Night Massacre, when he and Attorney General Elliot Richardson resigned their position from the Department of Justice rather than obey the order from the President to fire the Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. After leaving their Justice Department, he returned to the practice of law, and then later moving to Seattle, where he became the Senior Vice President of Legal Affairs of Weyerhaeuser Company. And in that time, with EPA in crisis, in 1983, President Ronald Reagan appointed him to serve as EPA Administrator again. He worked diligently and successfully returned EPA to the esteem of the public mind, turning the agency around. He then left EPA in 1985, rejoining Perkins Coie, and then later becoming Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Browning Ferris Industries. He served in that position until 1999. He has been on numerous boards. He has been Vice President of Weyerhaeuser. He is currently Strategic Director of Madrona Venture Group, where I am with him today. But Bill Ruckelshaus, on behalf of the Environmental Law Institute, which I now head, we want to let you know how much we honor you. We honor you as one of the architects of the environmental movement we have today, but we also honor you as someone who has shown by personal practice, by inspiration, and by example, your dedication to the rule of law, your advancement of environmental ideals, and those questions that I asked you about management expertise, about leadership prowess, and by personal integrity. We at the Environmental Law Institute revere you and honor you for those things that you have done for the country and the example that you set for all of us now and the example that you set for us in the future. Sir, thank you for this interview.
John, thanks very much for those kind comments. You're nice to say that.